Thank you. Um, okay, 20 minutes. So does that mean I have up to 5 minutes?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay, 5 minutes. Wow. Let me see how much I can do. Okay, I've already introduced on the proposing side that yes, Nigeria's underdevelopment is primarily due to the inherent structural flaws in its governing system. Okay, so let me just um when I was told about this debate, frankly speaking, I actually wrestled with the topic because for me, the moment I saw the topic, I felt like, I had this chicken and egg dilemma, like structural flaws, corrupt leaders. I actually struggled for a while. I know it's not something, I should be opening with considering the fact I'm here to debate, but it's just the truth. But the more I looked into the topic, the clearer certain things began to seem in my eyes. And I hope at the end of this debate, I'll be able to, present reasons to you as to why I believe that the current issue in Nigeria is due to our political system, is due to our governing system, and not the corrupt nature of the leaders. Before I continue, I would just like to state out my first point. I'll just drop my first point before I do any other thing because of our time. Um, After, during the colonial era, we all know what happened. We got our independence in 1960 and all of that. But pre before the coming of the Britain and why they came, certain things happened. If you remember, countries like Nigeria and countries like India and the likes, they had a lot of deaths due to things like malaria. Yes, once upon a time it was deadly due to things like malaria and all of that. So the areas or regions of the world like sub-Saharan Africa and other places of the world where you know living conditions were difficult, where living survival rates due to things like this were, quite lower. Different systems were implemented in those places relative to other places where we had, better chances of survival, like the US. Interestingly enough, US are also a product of the Great Britain. Yes, they were also colonized. Same thing with India. But when we check these three countries, Nigeria, India, US, it's, I think, obvious to most of us, or I think all of us, that Nigeria, is doing the least. And when we also check higher, you realize India is also doing lower or less than US is doing. And why is this? It's because of the systems that were put in those places. Because certain places like US, people were able to the Westerners or the Britons, they were able to stay and live in those places without deaths, malaria, mosquito, blah blah blah, and all of this stuff. There were a lot of persons, a lot of their citizens were able to live there. But in places like Nigeria, India, and the likes, where they could not actually live in, they had to use other forms of exploratory systems in those places to serve their goods. So, stating my first point, my first point to back up the proposition is the rule of law. Basically, my point is the erosion of normative order by the rule of law. Before they came, there were laws and orders in Nigeria. And of course, before I state this point, I must also state that according to global statistics, the growth of a nation, which right now I think the best way we can define growth of a nation is GDP per capita. And GDP per capita has a direct relationship with the rule of law. So we find out in countries where there's stronger rule of law, they do better. Nigeria, I'm not saying there's no rule of law in Nigeria. However, I am saying that the introduction of the rule of law by the Westerners or by the masters, it eroded something we had, which was our normative order. And just to buttress my point, let me quickly read an excerpt from a 5th century Chinese philosopher Confucius. They do Confucius, okay, from the Duke of Shea. We have an upright quote. I say, we have an upright man in our country. His father stole a sheep, and the son bore witness against him. Confucius replied, in our country, uprightness is something different from this. A father hides the guilt of his son, and a son hides the guilt of his father. It is in such conduct that true uprightness is to be found. I don't think I need to explain further that this is in contrast to the rule of law. However, This is an excerpt from Confucius. This is taken from the kind of society in which the Chinese lived then, which is similar to the kind of society in which we lived then. Back then, we were a communal people. We lived in clusters, we lived in covens, we lived in hamlets. So this was the kind of system. We never had this individualistic system that the rule of law brought in. So when the rule of law came, we began to struggle. We began to struggle between our inherent morals, our inherent way of life. We begin to have this clash between that and the rule of law, and that caused a lot of problem in our society as we see today. So I'll just go on. The rule of law, yes, okay. I've mentioned this point in our okay time. Okay, I'll soon be done. In our communal society, a man's first greatest responsibility is to his family. This was what was obtainable before. The clash between the rule of law and our inherent values renders the efficacy of the rule of law near impotent. Remember, I established earlier that the rule of law is a good thing. In countries where there's high obedience to the rule of law, there's increase in GDP per capita. But this obedience is not strong in countries like Nigeria because there's a clash between that and what we had, which were our normative values. Okay, make it okay. So just to buttress more because my time is almost out. I think okay. I'm so sorry. Let me just tie up my thoughts. So finally, the erosion of our normative order by the rule of law has rendered the rule of law inefficient. And this lack of efficacy of the rule of law has also rendered our growth, which is supposed to be tied to the obedience of the rule of law, it has rendered it what? Also useless. So instead of we having an increase in GDP per capita as our normal measurement of growth, we rather have what? We rather have a decrease because we cannot truly obey this because of the clash between those two. But before I close, I've read Confucius, but let me just also read somebody who is one of our own who is more familiar with us, Chinua Achebe. So in the words of Chinua Achebe, I quote: "The owner was the village, and the village had a mind. It could say to sacrilege, it could say no to sacrilege, but in the affairs of the nation, there was no owner. The laws of the village became powerless." And yes, this is the words of Chinua Achebe. So tying up this thought, I am saying now that we had a system that was working. It wasn't the best system, and obviously it had room for improvement. But the intrusion of the colonial masters and the placement of these other explorative systems alongside the rule of law created a clash between our normative values, our normative system, and the rule of law. And this clash rendered the potency of the rule of law impotent. It rendered it ineffective. And because the rule of law became ineffective in us, we have, a gradual decline, which we have seen over the years. So this is my opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Like I said, this evening just promises to be a very productive one. Just stay with us. You mentioned a lot of things that is really food for thought, and I believe we came with our pens, virus to go down and reflect on these things. All right, but just to throw a question, shouldn't we be open to change if the change is better?